I have been told before, we would hire you as a pastor if you were a married man. But I imagine you've been through something similar. Hello everyone, my name is Nick Whitaker. I'm a pastor in Southern California, and I'm so excited to be working with Salt talking about an important topic, which is why do so many single Christians feel like second-class citizens in the church? Now there's a number of ways we could take this question. But let's start with something familiar, which is what I think of as the single sigh. You've looked around at your church, at your life, and you've seen families and newlyweds, and you sort of let out the sigh of like, well, I guess I don't really belong here. This isn't for me. There's a number of reasons you could be saying that. The first one, which I empathize with, is sometimes there really is exclusion of single people. It's just a fact of life. People tend to hang out with those who are like them. Families want to hang out with families. Couples want to hang out with couples. And it leaves single people feeling like, well, what's left for me? And that's real, and we're going to get to that. But maybe another reason is we kind of feel like God doesn't value single people enough. Or we read the Bible, and it's been preached to us as if marriage is the real thing that matters. So I want to tackle both of those things. But let's start with the latter one, because I actually think it's more important. And we have to ask the question, well, why would it seem like this? If we start in Genesis, there's a pretty early spot where you'd find, clearly God likes married people. In Genesis 1:28, the first blessing God gives to his people is this. He says, be fruitful and multiply. Now, we might read that immediately and think, oh, okay, great. So have kids, and looks like, I'm not doing that. So I must have been failing. I must not be getting this blessing. I mean, we track this in sort of a funny way, though, don't we? People typically get married and have kids in their 20s and 30s, and so if we're late on that calendar or it doesn't happen, we often think, well, I've just missed my shot. I am a single person by definition, and therefore this blessing of being fruitful and multiplying just isn't for me. But if we dive deeper into Genesis, you'll find something much different. I mean, for instance, when God creates Adam, Adam is blessed with the whole earth, and yet he still has a complaint. And it's pretty interesting what it actually is. The first complaint in the entire world before the fall even happens is Adam says, there is no creature suitable to be my companion. There is nobody right for me. So what does God do? Does he say, tough luck, Adam, I should be enough? No, he does something pretty radical. He puts Adam into a deep sleep, one that he could perform surgery through without Adam waking up, removes a rib from Adam's side, out of which he forms Eve, and then wakes Adam up from this death-like sleep, to which Adam says in Genesis 2:23, this at last is bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. Now that's something, but it kind of sounds familiar to me. I can think of another guy, maybe one we talk about much more than Adam, who also went down into the depths of death, into a death-like sleep. I can think of the same person that when he had fallen into that death, his side was pierced and opened up, out of which came something that he would later be united to. And I can remember that person waking up from that death-like sleep and then proclaiming his unity with that. And then later down the line, I can also remember a proclamation of multiplication, that those two should multiply. And this person, of course, is Jesus, who was crucified, and when he had died into that death-like sleep, which lasted 3 days, when he had died, his side was pierced, out of which came water. Zechariah 13:10 tells us that a fountain was opened. A fountain will be opened because it's prophecy, for the cleansing of sin and the forgiveness of unrighteousness. And after that had happened, Jesus woke up. And that cleansing of sin, which had cleansed the bride of his, as Jesus described the bridegroom, to be pure for him. And you read all through Paul's epistles about Christ's union with his church. Romans 6 is a great place to go for that. It says we were baptized into his death, and we rise with him into the newness of life. There is a union between Christ and his church that happens because we've been cleansed by his death. But then there's that statement of multiplication. You see, in Genesis, it was be fruitful and multiply. But in Matthew 28, 18 through 20, it's something different, but similar enough. Jesus says, all authority on heaven and earth has been given to me. Go therefore, making disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to observe all that I command you. So, which is more important? Is it the human marriage of Adam and Eve, the first marriage? Or is it the greater marriage of Christ and his church? See, Ephesians 1:4 tells us that one was predestined. Christ is eternal. John 1 shows us that he was there at the creation of the earth, so he knows the whole story. And I would say that the divine marriage of Christ and his church is more superior. In fact, it's the prototype for the marriage of Adam and Eve. So, the marriage of Adam and Eve is a model for the marriage of Christ and his church. All Adam and Eve's marriage is doing is pointing to the union of Christ and his church. But that statement of multiplication, which we once read and felt excluded, is actually one we should feel included and perhaps even esteemed by. You see, having kids is one way to be fruitful and multiply, to make disciples. It's one thing to raise a child up in the faith, teach them the gospel, and raise them to go and make disciples. And then they have a family, and those kids are disciples. But the way most of us are prescribed to, in fact, all of us, if you want to include married people, is to go and preach the gospel to all who have not heard it. To literally make disciples. Multiplication happens whether you're single or not. So this whole command to be fruitful and multiply isn't an exclusive one to married people. It's actually an inclusive one. And if you want to be really, really cheeky about it, you can open up 1 Corinthians 7, where Paul says this. He says, I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided. And the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. I say this to your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. So, who's really got the benefit here? If the supreme marriage, if the supreme image of union and perfection in the world is Christ and his church and not human marriage, then I might be so bold as to say that this undivided devotion to the Lord as a single person is not a burden but a virtue. Now let me be clear what I'm saying and what I'm not saying. What I'm not saying is, yeah, you're single, get over it. No. Remember how God responded to Adam's cry of loneliness for companionship. God cares about this. He cares about your singleness. He cares that you're feeling lonely. But what he also cares about is that you value yourself as he values you. That you're not worthless until you find a wife or husband. But you have worth because you're made in his image. You have a calling because he's called you to make disciples. And that doesn't start happening when you get married, but it starts happening right now. You know, often when people hear the phrase gift of singleness, they think, oh, well, this is just God's gift of being lonely forever. That's not the case. No, if you're single, you have the gift of singleness. And that gift is to give your attention and love and care to the Lord. But then there's the other side of this whole question, which I imagine a lot of us struggle with too. I've certainly been there before, which is we really are excluded as single people in the church. Now, I'm not saying that universally. I'm not saying that's every church, not by a long shot. But it is the case that often enough, we feel as if we might be overlooked, excluded, or looked down upon by married people or families in the church. Now, we're in danger when we talk about this of generalizing too much. I mean, don't get me wrong. I've been in that spot before. As somebody who's worked in ministry for just a little while, I have been told before, we would hire you as a pastor if you were a married man. And you got to turn the other cheek and understand what's going on at that point, but I imagine you've been through something similar. But far more often have been the married couples when I was in college or when I was in high school who have decided to take me in as their own and care for me and love me. Far more often has it been that the married family, like the married friends that I interact with, have been loving and sweet, and they haven't excluded me from their life. Now, I don't know what the case is for you. I am encouraging you to look at the good and the bad. But two things I can suggest here, just a matter of practical wisdom. One thing that single people tend to do less, that married people tend to do more, is social entrepreneurship. I'm not saying you have to go and market yourself. What I mean by that is single people tend to less often be the people to say, hey, why don't you all come over for dinner? Why don't we start this event? Why don't we do this together? I don't know why this is, but this is just what I've observed and what seems to happen through most of the churches I've interacted with. One way you could reverse this role is by taking hold of the value you have as a single person and to start to be the one who builds community. People won't always be inviting you to things. Sometimes you have to be the one to reach out. And as a single person, that can be discouraging because you feel like people don't want to engage with people who are single. Most of the time, I want to encourage you that's not the case. Trust in the fact that the Lord is working in other people to be more gracious and kind than they currently are. And by being the sort of social entrepreneur, you can take part in this church community, which is meant for you, by actually taking the first step to build the community you feel you lack. And the second thing I think you can do, and what I've derived a great deal of benefit from, is start asking married people about marriage. We don't do this enough. But if you ask, how's your marriage going? What's it like? What did you think about before you got married versus now? What you'll find more often than not, I think, is that marriage is a difficult thing. It's not just this joyride through life now that you have another person, everything is easy, you split everything 50-50. It's difficult. It is hard. It's living life with another person that you're not always going to agree with. Now, I'm not married. So I don't know exactly what it's going to be like. I don't know if I will be married. But I do understand this. Marriage isn't this life status that single people need to be deeply envious of and feel discluded from. It's actually something that isn't an achievement. It's a commitment. It's not the end of your suffering as a single person. It's the beginning of your commitment as a married person. Should you look forward to it? Sure. But should you be prepared for it? Should you be ready for the fact that it's not going to all of a sudden solve all the problems in your life? That maybe life is just hard for everybody? Maybe life until Christ returns is going to feel lonely? Yeah. And one of the ways you can get that is by being candid about married life and single life with the married people and the families in your life. Find yourself in their homes. Spend time with them. And sometimes that's going to take a little push from you. Now, have I covered everything about feeling like a second-class citizen in the church? Absolutely not. There are going to be a lot of things that I missed. Your experience is probably different than I described. My hope, though, is that I've covered some of the biggest issues that seem to face us and some of the basic solutions we can take towards feeling like we actually belong in church, because we do. God says so. So, if you have any questions, leave them in the comments. I'd be happy to respond to them. I do watch those comments, and I love to have the conversations there. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.